Shabbat Shalom. So we often use the expression, many people often use the expression, missing the forest for the trees, right? Which is a good expression because it kind of indicates that sometimes we focus too much on the details and we miss the big picture. And especially if you're a bit obsessive compulsive, as I tend to be sometimes, you know, it's a good thing to remind yourself to see the forest and not the trees. On the other hand, there's also something to be said for missing the trees for the forest. That is, sometimes we look too much at the big picture and we miss the nuance and the texture and difference of each individual tree in that forest. And each individual tree has its own story to tell. So I think we need to balance these two things. We need to look both at the forest and at the trees. So looking at the big picture for the Tanakh, the Bible, for instance, we can see that the Bible could be understood as an instruction manual for living a good and a meaningful life. It starts with creation because it's not just a manual for living a Jewish life, but also tries to put in context the purpose of humanity generally. What is the proper role for human beings in God's creation? Later, it focuses more specifically on the role of the Israelites, the Jews, in humanity's general mission and purpose. The instruction manual gives us guidance in two main ways. First, it gives us rules to live by, like, don't murder, don't steal. They're up over there, over the ark in the Hebrew letters. Don't murder, don't steal, don't commit adultery, and so on. But it also instructs us by telling us stories of heroes and scoundrels. The stories encourage us to emulate the good behaviors of the heroes, while we learn what not to do from the behavior of the scoundrels. At the same time, the Bible also recognizes that nobody's perfect, so even the heroes make mistakes from time to time. So we also learn some things not to do from the mistakes that are made by the heroes. And because the Bible stories are 3,000 years old or more, some of these teachings may be a bit dated, and so we need to revise what we learn from them based on our development of the moral compasses that we've developed over the last 3,000 years. There are two particular pillars of morality that the Bible stresses over and over again, and I wanted to highlight them this morning. The first is justice, honesty, and fairness. And the second is kindness, compassion, and forgiveness. Now, these are both summarized as the prophet Micah says, and Rabbi Strauss mentioned last night, Higi lecha adam ma tov umad Adonai doresh mimcha. It has been told you, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires of you. Ki im asot mishpat, that you should do justice, ve'ahavat chesed, and you should love kindness and mercy. V'atznei alechet im Elohecha, and you should walk modestly with your God. The prophet Micah summarizes the teachings of God in these two pillars. You should do justice and love kindness. So we get aspects of justice like don't murder, don't steal, and don't commit adultery, all acts of justice and fairness. But we also have specific rules about kindness, like leaving the corners of your field for the poor, shooing the mother bird away from her nest before you take her eggs so she doesn't have a heart attack watching her babies being taken away. Or if you see a donkey struggling under its burden, you should help to lift the donkey up. These are acts of compassion. You see commandments that give us both rules of justice and rules of kindness. We also see this played out in rabbinic imagination about God's throne. The rabbis say God actually has two thrones, two seats that he sits on. One is Kisei Shel Din, the throne of justice and fairness, and the other is Kisei Shel Rachamim, the throne of kindness and mercy. And of course, on Yom Kippur, we ask that God sit on the throne of mercy and kindness when he's judging us, because nobody's perfect, and we want him to kind of overlook some of the faults and mistakes we've made. But the idea is that there's these two pillars even in God's world, justice and fairness, kindness and mercy. That's the big picture, the forest. Now let's zoom in on one tree, one story in today's Torah reading, and see how it adds nuance, texture, and detail to this big picture. There are 3 times in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, that we have a scene of a meeting at the well. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well. Yeah, there's 3 wells. So the first one is in this morning's Torah portion, when Abraham's servant meets Rebekah at the well, and she will become Isaac's wife. A couple weeks from now, we will read about how Jacob met his wife Rachel at the well, and she will become his wife. And then we read in the beginning of the book of Exodus that Moses meets Zipporah at a well, and she becomes his wife. Now, some might say that this reflects the original oral nature of the stories of the Torah, that they were told orally for generations, and so some of the details may have gotten confused or duplicated or repeated, and that's why we have these 3 different stories. And generally, I agree that the stories of the Torah were kind of told orally, and in some cases that helps us understand why we have some differences. But in this particular case, I think that's too simple. Why do I say that? Because meeting at the well in the ancient world is very much like meeting at the water cooler in an office today. The same thing, you're meeting for water. It's where people meet, they congregate, they're drinking, they schmooze, they talk. It's a place of social intercourse. And perhaps a better example would be meeting at a bar, the other watering hole. Right? Again, where people meet to talk over drinks and they have a social conversation. So it's not surprising that there would be several meetings at a well, because that's just a place where people met. What makes these stories interesting, though, is not the thing they have in common, but the differences that exist between them. So in Jacob's case, he sees Rachel at the well, and he's immediately smitten. He falls in love immediately. Apparently she was very attractive. All the shepherds had been gathering at the well so that they could together move this heavy rock off the mouth of the well so they could get the water inside. And they're waiting for all the shepherds to gather. Jacob takes one look at Rachel. He gets this burst of adrenaline. He runs over to the rock and he pushes it off all by himself, like Superman. So that's his meeting at the well. Moses sees Jethro's 7 daughters trying to water their flocks, their father's flocks, when some other ruffian shepherds come by and push them aside. Say, we're going to water our flocks first. Get out of the way. And Moses is incensed by the injustice and the violence of their act. And he rose to their defense, the Bible says, an act of justice, because that's what Moses' character is about. In this morning's Torah portion, the groom isn't even in the scene. Abraham sends his servant to get a wife for Isaac, and the servant makes a deal with God. He says, I'm going to ask the woman coming to this well if they will offer me a drink. And if she offers not only me a drink, but she offers also to water all the camels, then I will know this is the one for Isaac. And sure enough, Rebekah does just that. This is an act of kindness and compassion. So 3 things we can learn from this particular story of Rebekah at the well. The first is that the focus on this story is on the character of the woman. Rachel, we just know that she's pretty, and she got Jacob all excited, so he pushed the rock away. We don't really know too much about her. And the story of Moses, there's 7 women there, and we don't really know anything about them. He just doesn't like the fact that they got pushed aside. In this story, the focus is all about Rebekah and her character. And it's particularly important that she is kind and compassionate, and that's the second thing I wanted to highlight. Her character is about kindness and compassion. Why is that important? Well, you have to think about what Isaac has just been through. His father nearly sacrificed him to God as some kind of act of loyalty. Now, Isaac wasn't a boy when this happened. According to our Midrash, he was in his 30s. So he could have not participated. He was clearly a willing participant in this act. But nevertheless, it must have been a shattering experience for him. The Bible doesn't even record that he saw his father alive again after this happened. And immediately after this act, Isaac's mother, Sarah, dies. So Isaac is basically alone and broken. And what Abraham's servant realizes is that what this man needs is a woman who will love him and take care of him and nurture him and be kind to him. And so the deal he makes with God is I'm looking for a woman who will do these things for Isaac because that's what he needs. And so the character of Rebekah is really crucial to this story. And finally, the third thing we learn is that the groom is actually passive. He's not even in the story. He's absent. But it's the woman who is active. The woman plays a tremendously active role. First of all, she draws the water. She draws a lot of water. Remember, they're camels. Camels drink lots of water. That's their thing. They drink water so they can travel long distances without needing more. And she waters not one camel, but several camels. That's a lot of water that she's drawing. And she runs to get the water, like Abraham ran to greet his visitors earlier in Genesis. She is even asked by her family, do you want to go with this man? We never see that in any other story. The woman is asked her opinion. That's an amazing thing. And she says, yes, I want to go. So she is a very active person in this drama. By contrast, in keeping with Isaac's generally passive character, he's not even there. It's a shame that for so many centuries, we men have recorded so little about the heroism of our mothers, our sisters, and our wives. Men have taken far too long to recognize the amazing contributions of women, and we should celebrate those occasions in which they're recognized in the Torah story. So these are three things we learn from this particular tree, this particular story. It's about the character of the woman that's involved, and particularly her kindness and her compassion, and finally that she played an active role in the story. All three of the stories at the well teach us something. This one teaches us about compassion and kindness. Jacob's story is going to teach us about romance and love. And the story with Moses teaches us about justice and fairness. And again, 2 out of these 3 stories refer back to those 2 pillars of the Bible, compassion and kindness, justice and fairness. So it's important not only to look at the forest, the big picture, but also to study the trees and what we can learn from each individual story. Shabbat Shalom.